Welcome, everyone. Can you all hear me? Great. Grab a seat, grab a sandwich. Opposite order. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Angela Kelly, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and CAP Action is thrilled to have you all and our terrific panel. This event is entitled The Real Story Behind the Latino Electorate of 2016. And we wanted to host this event because in the ensuing fog that followed the election, one particular storyline of what happened was really at odds with what we had seen leading up to the election. And that was, how were Latino voters looking at the presidential candidates, and where were they leaning? And we saw after the election a number of exit polls reporting very high support, that exceeding what Mitt Romney got, of the Latino community for Donald Trump. And we wanted to get underneath that a little bit because it was very much at odds with the polling we had seen leading up to the election, and then polling that was done particularly by Latino Decisions. And we have one of their principals and founders here to walk us through that. But let me just lay out for you a little bit about how this is going to go. First, we're going to hear from Rui Teixeira. He is a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. He's going to talk generally about Latino voters. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, sort of Oprah style. I'm Oprah. I know. Comes to mind when you look at me. And Matt Barreto, who's a principal at Latino Decisions, is going to talk a little bit about their polling, contrast it with the exit polling, and then we're going to have a terrific conversation with Estuardo Rodriguez and Emmy Ruiz. Estuardo is principal at the Raven Group and is an expert on the Florida Latino vote, and Emmy Ruiz is a political activist and consultant and an expert on the state of Nevada and what happened in 2016. So we're going to dig deep on two states after we hear from two experts on the Latino electorate generally, and then their performance in the 2016 election. Really thrilled to have you all here. Thank you very much. Rui.
Hello all, thanks for turning out to learn a little bit and talk a little bit about this very important subject. And the subject is the Latino electorate. Who are they? How did they really vote in this election? And so on. And this is actually like a pretty important subject. If you look at the data from the States of Change project, which I've been involved in here at the center and with a number of other institutions for several years, we're trying to map out the future demographic structure of the U.S. electorate. According to our estimates, by the time we get to 2060, 27% of eligible voters in the United States will be Latino. It'll be like 40% in Colorado, 48% in Arizona, 44% in Nevada, 18% in states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and on it goes. It's, the Latino electorate is spreading to every state in this country and becoming obviously increasingly important over time. Well, that would suggest that it's becoming increasingly important to get this right if we're going to think about this group, what its politics are, and what it really wants. And I think there are definitely grounds for thinking at this point we are not, in fact, getting it right, that there are some real problems with how we're looking at this population, which can be very difficult to poll. And that really comes down in particular to something we're going to talk a lot about today, which is the exit polls. The exit polls, you can't live with them and you can't live without them. It's something everybody looks at right after the election. It's, get way more publicity than any other piece of data about any given election. But the fact of the matter is that the exit polls are in many ways quite problematic. And they're problematic in ways people don't really understand. The exit polls, recall what they're created for. They're created to help the networks and so on, and news organizations make calls about states. And their precinct sampling is done in such a way that they can make these extrapolations. It doesn't necessarily follow that the representation these exit polls give you about the voting proclivities of various subgroups will be therefore correct. Quite the contrary, there can be real problems depending on how these precincts are selected, because keep in mind, the exit polls are not constructed to give you a reliable estimate of the voting tendencies of subgroups, even though that is what we use them for. There are lots of problems with, I mean, just take one example that we won't get into today, but is very salient, which is, if you look at the exit polls, you would think that most voters in the United States were college educated. That's almost certainly not true. As far as we can tell, the exit polls chronically oversample college-educated voters, chronically undersample non-college educated voters. If you compare the Census Voter Supplement survey, which is, I think, quite reliable, probably the most reliable survey we have about turnout and the composition of the electorate, there are huge differences in this respect. Probably about 8 points lower college-educated representation, 8 points higher non-college educated representation. So it's not like we aren't pretty sure that the exit polls already have a lot of significant problems. And keep in mind, too, the exit polls typically, if you criticize the exit polls, one of the things the pollsters themselves will say, these other people, they're bringing up a survey, they talk to somebody over the phone. I mean, we talk to actual voters. Well, that's increasingly untrue because, the nature of the way the voting process works in the United States today is to capture early voters and people who vote by mail. You have to talk to them over the phone anyway. So it's not like there's this, clear and total and absolute comparative advantage of the exit polls over other polls, even in that respect. So thinking about those ideas about the exit poll and how they may not be completely accurate and they may not, in fact, give us the exact right estimate for various subgroups, particularly small subgroups. Are there any problems with the Latino vote that we might know about that might have come up in the past? Well, absolutely. People don't remember this very well because it was a while ago and it was a little bit wonky, I suppose. But in 2004, the exit polls estimated that the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, God bless him, got 44% of the Latino vote, and the Democrat only got 53%. There was a tsunami of criticism of that, suggesting it did not match up with precinct results, didn't match up with county results, just generally seemed kind of fishy. And eventually, in essence, the exit poll people backed down. They released all their data and allowed people to look at it, and eventually they sort of allowed as well, 58-40 was probably closer to it now that we think about it and we look at this, even the state polls we've taken and aggregate them, it tells a bit of a different story. So that was 2004. Now, if there was that big a problem back in 2004, what is our reason for believing they corrected all the things that would lead to potential problems in the future? The answer is that we have no reason to think that. As far as we can tell, the methodology just hasn't changed that much. And they're pretty opaque now about what they do and how they do it. Even though they're asked questions to provide more specifics, we typically don't get them. And after the 2004 thing, they've been much more circumspect about releasing their data, perhaps because they just don't want people to look at it that closely. So forwarding to this election, what do we know based on the polls? Well, the exit polls tell us that in 2012, Obama carried the Latino vote by 71-27. According to them, in this election, Donald J. Trump was a 68-28 loser. So actually, the Democratic vote went down and the Republican vote went up slightly, despite Donald Trump's pretty well documented lack of interest, if not hostility, in the Latino community. So that seems a little strange. Now, if you compare this to the Latino Decisions data, they not only have it higher. For example, in 2012, they had the Democrats carrying the Latino vote 75-23. In this election, they have it at 79-18, which kind of makes sense given what we know about Trump, given what we know about this election. But you notice the trend's in the exact opposite direction. Instead of the Democratic margin compressing, as the exit polls allege it did, we have it increasing. So this is just a big, kind of moment. I mean, I guess it's possible. Look, anything's possible in this world, but how probable is it? How plausible is this? So Matt's going to talk a lot about if you drill down on these data and take a very, very careful look at them, it just seems kind of implausible the exit polls are correctly representing this situation. Other academics have already started looking at the data, including drilling down all the way to the precinct level. And I think there's some pretty convincing assessments already out there about Arizona and Texas, and I think more are coming online, that really make it hard to match up the way the exit polls assessed the Latino vote, both nationally and in a lot of states, with with the actual voting data. So sort of circle back to my original point, this isn't just an arcane methodological fight among pollsters. This is actually pretty important. This population, every year, every cycle becomes more important to the political, economic, and social future of America. And I think it's pretty important that we get it right and not put our faith in flawed instruments that, while they may provide some insights, just are not as reliable and not as sort of, they do not encapsulate the truth. Let's just put it that way. It's time for us to take a broader look at this population, look at other data sources, and in that way try to get at the truth of the situation. And that's really what the panel here today is about. So with that, I'll just turn it over to the good offices of the panel.
All right, great. Mics are on. Everyone can hear us? Good, excellent. So Matt, I think I want to just turn it right over to you and have you give us some of the highlights so that, because that will set the stage for the rest of the conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Angie, and thanks to Rita as well for organizing this panel and inviting me to present today. Rui teed it up really well with his discussion and questions of the exit polls, and I'd like to just follow up on that on some of the data that we've collected ourselves, as well as other data that we've seen others in this field collect, and walk through just a couple of examples here in some slides that I have, and I'll try to get through those quickly and then just turn it back over to the panel discussion. So if we could get those slides. There we go. All right, thank you. I'm going to jump down here, if that's okay, so I can see them and walk you guys through this. I'm going to try to go through this quickly because we have a lot of stuff to cover. Abigail, how you doing? See some friends in the audience there. And we have a lot to cover, and so I'm going to try to walk through this quickly. If there's anything where people need more follow-up information, we're going to catalog these slides with CAP so that people can have those and download them and look at them when you have more time later, as well as we'll have stuff on our website. So let me just start out at the start of the story, which is what Rui said. The Latino Decisions election eve poll, which was done in the 3 to 4 days before the election, estimated that nationally it was 79 to 18 in the presidential vote. However, the national exit poll, in terms of their original estimate on election night and through a couple of weeks, they're now starting to adjust it a little bit, which 66-28, so 1 point in each direction, right. So there's a slight adjustment there, as probably as more of the California data came in and they realized that they were off there. But how did they arrive at 65-29? This is considerably different than 79-18. Number one, these are the most important questions. A lot of what I'm going to present to you are questions that we have to have answers to if as consumers of data, we don't just believe something that someone puts on TV. Think about all those debates we had during the election about, is that poll accurate? I mean, this was just, and now suddenly the exit polls present a poll and we're just supposed to take their word for it. Which precincts did they select? As Rui said, their precinct selection pattern is not one that is randomly selected. In fact, they say that they can't tell us which precincts they selected because they already know they're going to go back there in 2020. So this sort of suggests they're not randomly selected. How many of these were in Latino neighborhoods? How many Spanish interviews did they conduct? And then does their Latino sample match the known census demographics of our community? This is a very, very important part of polling, so we know that certain people have higher response rates and we need to weight the data to match. To that extent, we've provided the demographics of our sample. Here's the census estimate in column 1. What percentage of all Latino voters are Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, other? What percent have less than a high school degree? What percent have over a college degree? Breakouts by age categories, language. And you see for the national exit polls, I can only fill in question marks because they haven't revealed any of this information about their Latino sample. We just want to know what percentage of your Latinos, do they match the actual census demographic characteristics of our community? And to date, they have not revealed any of that information. Not just to date, as Rui said, in previous years, they haven't done that as well. So to start with, 20% of their data now comes from a pre-election telephone survey of early voters. So they're starting to do that. We think that if they only focused in that effort, they would probably get a more reliable sample, because with this telephone survey of early voters, you can get a random representative sample of everyone across the entire state. The problem is they mix that in with 80% of their sample. Most of their sample comes from a very small handful of precincts on election day, which are not representative of our community. They tend to oversample places where the election might be close so that they can read the tea leaves and pass those pieces of information on to the decision desk in the media. You're talking about maybe 50 precincts in a state out of 5,000 or 6,000. 50. Let me give you one example. In 2014, the exit poll in the midterm selected 0 precincts in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. 0. This is where 25% of all Latinos in Texas live. They had none in that entire region because from their perspective, it wasn't going to be competitive there. It didn't offer them any new and interesting information. From my perspective, I need to have 25% of my precincts there because that's where 25% of my community is. And this was revealed in a Monkey Cage Washington Post article afterwards. And as a result, they said they then went and added one in 2016 so that we couldn't make this claim anymore. But there was one this year somewhere. Who do they count as Hispanic or Latino? This is a very important question. If you want to reveal data about Latinos, we want to know who is included in that. At the very beginning of the exit poll, just with any research that any of us do, there's a very basic question. What do you consider your race or ethnicity? I want everyone to think of that question in their head. What do you consider your race or ethnicity to be? You're filling out some sort of government form or any form you filled out 100 times. After that, later in the survey, they have a follow-up question to attempt to find, in their words, and this was revealed by David Adams in a Univision.com article, more assimilated and acculturated Hispanics that they think are being missed. So if you said that you consider yourself to be white, when presented with all of the choices, on the very first question on the exit poll, it says white, Latino, African American, Asian American, Native American, Middle Eastern, Arab American, all of these choices are there. So you could have selected Latino, but you selected white. Later, there's a follow-up question. And in their own analysis, they report that there are extreme differences between people who self-identify as Latino or between people who self-identify as white and say, oh, yeah, but I do have some Hispanic ethnicity. They group all of those together. Where do they get their Latino respondents? According to the census, 48% of Latinos live in majority Latino neighborhoods. So about half of us live in majority Latino neighborhoods. We think they have almost none, maybe 5%. They're not going into those heavily Latino precincts to do their interviews. And as a result, they're missing where the true community is. We're just asking for them to report their demographics. So let me just quickly roll through a couple of opinions. Right after election night, it wasn't just Rui who was finding a problem with this. Nate Silver said that you should use a lot of caution, specifically regarding the Hispanic vote in the exit poll. He said it doesn't look right, and he says maybe actually not just a little bit, but a lot of caution. There was an article recently in the Arizona Republic said why the exit polls are wrong about Latino voters in Arizona, published by Stephen Nuno, who's a professor at Northern Arizona University. There was an article in the Monkey Cage Washington Post just last Friday saying that the Texas estimates of 34% are wrong, published by Francisco Pedraza, who's a professor at UC Riverside in California. And let me reference, Rui and I did not compare notes or collaborate here on this, but let me reference that infamous 2004 exit poll that they did. They were forced to do a self-critique of the exit poll in that year, in 2004. And they said in there, the exit poll in reference to the Hispanic sample, this is their report, which is on the ABC News website, it is not designed to yield very reliable estimates of the characteristics of small geographically clustered demographic groups. These groups have a much larger design effect and larger sampling errors. They go on at the bottom to say, if we want to improve the national exit poll estimates for the Hispanic vote, we would need to either drastically increase the number of precincts or oversample Hispanic precincts. As Rui said, they have not done either of these things. Heading into the election, these are the final Latino sample surveys by the Univision Washington Post. They had Trump at 19. The final NBC Telemundo oversample, they collaborated on an occasional oversample, had Trump at 17. The final Naleo Telemundo data point had him at 14. The FIU New Latino Voice poll had him at 13. And a statistical model done by our statistician had Trump at 18. So these were the final large sample Latino-specific data points. And let me just show you a little bit from our survey then. When you think about the candidates, again, remember, they are asking us to believe that Trump did better than Romney. How do you feel that these candidates are reaching out to the Latino community? Among Latinos who evaluated Trump, 13% thought he was doing a good job, truly cares. 29% said he doesn't really care about us. And 55% of Latinos viewed in 2016 Trump as hostile towards Latinos. You see, in contrast, Clinton has the different. But the point that I want to contrast it to is not Clinton, it's Romney. Because all this debate has been over whether or not Romney has done better. In 2012, exact same sample model, everything the same with our survey in 2012, our election eve survey. 56% of Latinos thought Romney doesn't really care about Latinos. Only 18% identified Romney as hostile. That went from 18% to 55%. This was not just the Latino Decisions poll found this. This was found in poll after poll throughout 2016. In these large sample 5,000 person surveys, it doesn't make sense that we would see this sort of increase. So now I'm just going to walk you through one example of some real election data, turn it back over to the panel to get into some more richer discussion of what happened in 2016 and how we move forward. So rather than showing you any additional Latino Decisions data, I'm going to summarize some data that we've seen for some other states. This is a look at the most heavily Latino precincts, individual precincts in Texas. And we've highlighted there in red the column of the percent of Latinos voting for Clinton. And you can see here in these heavily Latino precincts in Texas, you have 83, 82, 79, 76, 83, 82, etc. When we put this information out, we don't see any evidence in Texas of Trump being at 34%. And in fact, not only do you see those numbers for Clinton, but if you directly compare them to the Obama numbers, they're higher. But what I want to summarize for you is this article that was done by Francisco Pedraza, professor at UC Riverside, that was just published. You can find it December 2nd in the Monkey Cage, Washington Post. Rather than just looking at these 10 or 20 or 30 Latino precincts, what Pedraza did was downloaded all the precincts that he could get for the entire state of Texas and conducted an analysis to look what the patterns were of the Latino vote there. What this chart shows you, this is every single little dot on there is a precinct in Texas. Okay? And he's asking it to fit a regression line to find a pattern. What is the pattern that these precincts are showing us? From precincts on one side that have almost no Latinos, where it says 0% Latino, to the precincts on the other, which are 98, 99% Latino. And what you can see is that there's a very, very clear relationship. Over 4,000 precincts in this analysis finds that the Clinton vote was about 77% among Latinos, and that the Trump vote was less than 20. Remember, the exit poll claims 61-34. He not only looked at the whole state, but then broke it out by region, because some people argue that this was happening in rural areas. And when he broke it out by region, he found that in large urban centers like Harris County, the Latino vote was closer to 80 to 14%. That in medium population areas like Fort Bend or Nueces County, where Corpus is, it was about 73 to 18. And then in small rural areas, like in the Valley or in East or West Texas, it was 77 to 18. There was no pocket in the entire state of Texas that was anywhere near 61-34. None. Yet that's what the exit poll reported. And he has this histogram suggesting what the probability is that the exit poll estimate is right, down here in the corner. And this dotted line here is the exit poll estimate. You see it falls in the tail of about a 3% probability that that was correct. And the Latino Decisions estimate is over there, not exactly in the center, but near the center where most of the action is. The final thing I want to show you is just an analysis of whether or not Clinton did better or worse than Trump, or than Obama, excuse me. So again, in the Pedraza analysis, they have all of the precincts in Texas. Anything above the bar is an area where Clinton won more net raw votes than Obama did. The red precincts below are places where she did worse than Obama. And you can see if you just isolate this area over here that's 75% or more Latino, there are 864 precincts that are 75% higher, that Clinton won more total net votes than Obama in 80% of those. So there's no evidence that she ran behind Obama. There's no evidence that she only won 61% of the vote. When you look at the real precinct data, you see this pattern. I'm going to leave all of these slides here for you guys to look at. I'm just going to click through these very quickly so you can see that I'm not just picking on one state. This is Arizona. Latino Decisions analysis found the exact same thing. This is Florida. The exact same thing, breaking out by Miami, Broward, different counties. This is Nevada. The exit poll estimated 29%. The average there was 16% for Trump. This is New Mexico. Virginia, the 20 most heavily Latino precincts. Wisconsin, Milwaukee has a very, very large Latino population. Pennsylvania, the 20 most heavily Latino precincts. California, Illinois, New York, Ohio. We have data on almost every single state. Almost every single state. There's no state in which the exit poll estimate for Trump comes even within 15 points of what they're estimating. And we're going to continue looking at this, and we encourage other people to look at the data and see what the true story is. Thank you.
Very much, Matt. Yeah, definitely. Round of applause. You made math understandable. That's terrific. I want to get to talking about Florida and Nevada, but like the question that's just hanging out there, I think, for everybody is like, so what do we do about it, right? How do you get them to unearth and pull back and lift up the hood on things that they want to keep down and dark?
Yeah, I think that the exit poll shifted. Rui gave a little bit of an explanation of this. The exit poll shifted from a private good to a public good. I think we can all agree now it's a public good. Everyone relies on it. The media is obsessed with these sub-analyses in the exit poll, and it affects public policy. If people say this is how, because of that, because it's no longer a private good where they did a survey just for the decision desk so that they could give it to them on election night and say, hey, this is going to help you call the election. If that's what they were doing, then it's their business. They have a proprietary methodology, great. But when they pull it into the public for public consumption, we have to hold them accountable and say, show us the data. Show us the transparency. And that's what we've attempted to do in all of our analyses, is put our data out publicly for people to see, answer any questions about our data. And so the more that we can continue to ask these questions of them, Javier Becerra put out a statement a couple of weeks ago demanding that the media companies and Edison, the company that collects the data, to just show us the basic demographics of their Latino sample. They still haven't done that. So I think the more that we can ask them to just show us what their data are, then we can start to understand if it has any biases, where it has biases. But right now we're in the dark. And so I encourage all of us to continue asking these hard questions.
Yep, we will circle back on this in advance of the next election for sure. All right, let's go to two really important states that you flagged, Matt, and that tell slightly different stories, but I think are also in the same direction as what Matt was just describing. And Emmy, I want to turn to you. You are my Nevada, Colorado expert. I view what happened in Nevada on Election Day as one of the bright spots. So maybe you can just share with the audience what did happen, and like what is I think of like the secret sauce of how you organize people and engage the Latino vote in the state of Nevada. Talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Angie. Thank you so much for letting me be here today. I often told my team in Nevada and Colorado that even on a really dark day for our country, the work that they did was a tremendous bright spot. And that is thanks to the organizers that were on the ground, but also the Latino community who, any opportunity they had to show up for Hillary Clinton, I believe that they did. So I would say I was a state director in Nevada for the caucus for Hillary, and then I was a state director in the general election for Colorado. And I'd say that there are definitely some similarities that I would encourage people to try to replicate as we move forward as progressives, as whether we're talking about the party or in campaigns. I think the first and foremost is early investment and ensuring that we're taking absolutely nothing for granted. By the time Election Day rolled around just a few weeks ago, our campaign had been in Nevada for 2 years. And so, we got there in August, I got there in March of 2015. We started organizing on April 12th, which is the day that we announced immediately. And people were saying, well, why are you here? You're so early. There's a lot of work to be done, especially amongst the Latino community in Nevada that is incredibly transient, that's immigrant, that's first generation. And I think the thing that was so important for us is also to build community-based programs. And I really believe that Nevada, in more ways than one, really helped shape our campaign, how we approached Latino outreach in a way that was not treating the Latino community as a monolithic group, but looking at Latinos in subgroups, looking at them by age, looking at them by what region of the state that they lived in, whether they were Spanish speakers or English speakers. We did that as an organization, but we also replicated that online. We did that with our TV ads and making sure that, people I think a lot of times are saying, well, but you weren't on Univision or you weren't on Telemundo. That didn't mean that we weren't targeting Latinos. I spend the vast majority of my time as a young Latina millennial, watching maybe cable TV or whatever the case was. And so we really try to target that as much as possible. I think the other component that I'm so proud of is that we built so many community-based programs. We had 2 young organizers in Nevada, Natalie Montelongo and Vanessa Valdivia, who started this program called Mujeres in Politics that ended up becoming a national program. And when you think about, the caucus, think of how many people in Nevada do you think understand the caucus process, right? You use the word caucus and people would say, "What'd you just call me? Are you kidding me?" But these groups like Mujeres in Politics, like the Caucus Conmigo program, really helped create a community engagement and community excitement, and people felt that they had a very personal stake in that. I think the other thing that's so important to mention is our partners in these states. When in the summer of 2015, I remember meeting with the AFL-CIO. Of course, they didn't endorse until much later, but they were doing a lot of really important work in cultivation, along with, for example, the Culinary Union, registering voters, talking to their members about what happened in 2014, and making sure that what happened then would never, ever happen again in Nevada, and they certainly made sure to take that back. Our partners, along with the candidates in both states, really also helped us tell the message of why this race is so important and why it is, what is at stake. Catherine Cortez Masto is absolutely a tremendous bright spot.
Elected senator, yep.
But another one is Ruben Kiwen, who is the new member of Congress in CD4 in Nevada, who is an immigrant, is the son of a casino worker and culinary member. And, for example, in Colorado, our new majority leader of the assembly is a young Latina. And so these community leaders really helped us tell this story. But, I also have to mention the work that Hillary did. And the first time she came to Nevada, she met with Dreamers. And I think that really, put a stake in the ground that said, no one is going to match our commitment to the Latino community. We're going to go to places that we've not gone before as a campaign or as a candidate. We're going to have these really difficult conversations. It's going to require an evolution of a relationship, which it did with those Dreamers, and I think Dreamers across the country. But I think that was the first sign of many, that this was a community that was very, very important for us, right? Dreamers are not allowed to vote in our country, and neither are their parents, but they represent so much to what we're fighting for. And so that was so important to her, and it's something that we really continued throughout the campaign. And last but not least, I think that this is something that we should talk about, is making sure that campaigns have a level of cultural competence and making sure that our staffs and our organizers on the ground reflect that. One thing that I'm incredibly proud of is in Colorado, we had the only Latino organizing state director, and that was Alana Mounds, and she built a program that was incredibly diverse. When you are at the table, you're making sure that our communities are represented. Jorge Neri, another one, he ran Nevada in the general election and was our organizing director there for the caucus. I think these decisions and ensuring that our communities are represented at every level of an organization have a tremendous impact across the board. Because what happens is, for example, we had Latino organizers in Colorado Springs. I know that when you think of the Latino community in Colorado, that's not a region that normally comes up. Well, here's this young woman, Alicia, who's an organizer there. They built this tremendous Mujeres in Politics program. They invited me to go out and speak. They must have been very desperate. But I went out, and when I walked into the room, it ended up being like a Familias in Politics. I mean, it was literally like at a dance hall. It was full of families making commitments for registration, for GOTV, people that were getting involved. And I credit that for a reason why we were able to hold off Donald Trump in Colorado Springs. And so, whereas we were never going to win it, he did not make more gains than Mitt Romney, which in a lot of these red communities is not the case. And so I think looking at the Latino community beyond these traditional strongholds, for example, East Las Vegas, but looking at Reno, looking at Fort Collins, which is another booming Latino community, or the Slopes in Colorado, which are so service-oriented. And so, I think these are just some of the bright spots that we've identified. But I do believe that the future is bright. We're in very murky territory, but I've spent the last 2 years working with these organizers in these communities. And the Latino community, I really believe, is just getting started.
That's terrific. I'm glad you feel the future is bright. I'm still
Am I the only one?
yeah, because you haven't been in Washington again that long.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'm getting out of here
Yeah,
immediately
exactly,
after,
right? Can
yeah.
I get on the flight with you? All right. So, but so many points that you made. I want to talk to you, Estuardo, and bring you into it regarding Florida, right? Because there you've got a very dominant Cuban population for so many years, tended to vote Republican, and then in the more recently, we have seen an influx of Puerto Ricans coming, many from New York, a lot from Puerto Rico, who tended to vote more Democratic. So this is something that I know you spend a lot of time on and study. Can you just kind of paint for us a little bit of a picture of what those two communities look like?
It's actually amazing. And first, thanks very much for the invitation. I think that people are going to look at Florida for a long time in terms of as a case study of what mobilized Latinos to go out and vote. But more importantly, the layers were so complex in terms of not just the demographic breakdown, but the personal experiences of the Puerto Rican community coming from the island. And we're talking about 33 families a day coming from the island. And these families aren't families that, number one, I think for some people take for granted that you're Puerto Rican and you're allowed to vote, so you're going to come to the United States and it's easy, low-hanging fruit, let's just get them out to vote. But they are not that unlike the immigrant families that are coming from Central America and Peru and all over Latin America who are coming for a job, who are coming for a roof over their heads. There was a great deal of information that came out trying to understand the Puerto Rican family and their experience coming to the mainland, their level of education, their median income, much lower than their Latino counterparts in Florida. So it made it harder to reach out to them with just the register to vote. You had to appeal to them within the larger context of the fiscal crisis, the fact that they're coming because the hospitals are shutting down, the schools are closing. There's so many real experiences for them that we normally look at as a broader Latin American experience that drives people to the United States. But this is Puerto Rico, which, honestly, I think the Congress takes for granted as part of the United States, and that's why they're in the situation they are. But that's a separate story. But again,
that'll be our next
those are
event.
the layers.
I'll have you back for that.
Right. But those are the layers that we're talking about. And so I applaud the work of Center for Community Change and Organized Now on the ground. Many Latino organizations, they came together even after the Pulse nightclub massacre, that you had Somos Orlando. And all of these incidents, all of these created an opportunity to come together. And these organizations, many of them including Hispanic Federation that form part of this Somos Orlando, really reached out. I think some of the data that we've seen, and I think some of the things that we're talking about, and probably what you experienced in Nevada, I want to say that right, Nevada, was true in that you have to reach out to them with that personal engagement and connection and not just a generic, register to vote. And then you contrast that with the growing Cuban American experience. And I went to college in Barry University down in Miami Shores, Florida. Did my time working for a council member, and then of course you have to bartend in South Beach for a few years. So I did all that.
Must have been rough, huh?
It was tough. It was tough. So had this been at nighttime, I would have made drinks for you guys later. But that kind of shift in the demographic, generational shift, leaning more democratic. Even if you look at the numbers today, where in Florida, a larger Latino percentage, over 30% that voted for Donald Trump, I don't think you saw that kind of number in any other state break 20%, right? Based on the great numbers the Latino Decisions shared. But you would have seen larger numbers if it wasn't for the Puerto Rican community in the I-4 corridor. That I-4 corridor, where much of Florida was very distressed in terms of Latino community that Hillary lost, they had major victories. Darren Soto for the House of Representatives. They were able to elect the first Puerto Rican out of Florida as a member of Congress. That is a huge victory for them. Victor Torres to the Florida Senate. Emily Bonilla to the Orange County Commissioner's Office, and I think I'm missing one more, Amy Mercado to the Florida House. I mean, these are celebrations for the community, and the only way that they were able to do that was by including the flavors of Puerto Rico, which meant the caravanas. The car after car and the parades going down the street to register to vote, to turn out the vote for the early vote, the music. It was an entire experience. And that was thanks to the folks on the ground who understood that in Puerto Rico, the national sport is politics.
Right.
And you're bringing that with you. And that connection also meant family and it meant home. You compare that with the Cuban community that has been there for generations now. They may not have the caravanas, but they have a very strong allegiance and a loyalty dating back to, and evidenced by Ronald Reagan Way in Little Havana. Something that when I was going to college, I still couldn't understand it, except I was like, okay, I get it.
Let
I
it
get
go.
it, kind of. Obviously, I haven't. But it's one of those things now that you have to appreciate that connection between them as they look at even the Cuban vote, looking at issues that tend to be democratic, such as climate change. I mean, there are so many issues now that need to be used and will continue to be used to bring over that next generation of Cuban voters as well, especially as you look at the Puerto Rican numbers hitting and surpassing New York City Puerto Rican numbers. We're talking over 1 million Puerto Ricans in Florida and in the I-4 corridor concentrated. That's an amazing massing of political power. And we have to acknowledge that they're not missing that. They get it because it is a national sport for them on the island. So we can only look forward to even greater success from the I-4 corridor if these groups continue to engage in the right way. You're looking at a 2018 governor's race. And of course, every in the midterm elections, every cycle, you're going to look at how these Puerto Rican voters are going to turn out in mass numbers for people that get it. The last thing I'll throw in there as well, which I thought was as crucial, in addition or beyond to the direct outreach and the personal engagement through caravanas or any other familial kind of gathering, everyone's stuck on their phone. And they're using their phones for the connection to the family. And we had an amazing opportunity to work with Me Too and created these viral videos, one that was tied around our campaign, Que Vote Mi Gente, bringing back Frankie Negrón and a classic song that we interpreted to get people excited about voting and told the story and used a lot of imagery. And you have to keep these short because these are videos online, but we were able to do that as well as throw some comedic flavor where you had one of these viral influencers, video influencers, online influencers, make a joke about the culture at home and how your grandma would come and hit you with the chancleta if you didn't come to vote or didn't register to vote. So many nuances that people got on the island and pushed those videos out. And overall, we had, I think combining the 3 videos that we had about 120 million impressions. And the amount of people that we were able to activate through that, obviously you can't always tell beyond, after they click, you can't always tell if they went out to vote, but you look at Osceola County in Orange County where we were targeting, and you saw that the early vote was in Orange County twice as much as the previous presidential, and in Osceola County it was 3 times as much as the previous presidential. Then you're seeing, okay, there's a connection here, not only because of the direct outreach and engagement, but because you're present everywhere, no matter where they are on their phone or with family on television, even electronic billboards, digital billboards that we had up. You could start seeing that where we had a presence, there was direct and immediate turnout. And the last tool that I thought, as I mentioned, the Pulse nightclub, we partnered with Grindr. And at first people were wondering how that was going to work out. We had 44,000 in language, Spanish language, 44,000 impressions of people clicking on go register to vote or vote early through Grindr, and it was an amazing opportunity to really connect with the Latino LGBT community out there. So you can't leave any door unopened. And I think that proved the numbers. That's going to continue to prove.
Let me say one thing on.
Now, you could jump in here because they're talking a lot about you have to have cultural competence, right, to reach the community. And so, how does that translate for you when you're actually polling the community?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, this is, I think, the theme that we would all agree on is that you need to be integrated at every level. And you need to be using all strategies. And that if you're not doing it from a culturally competent standpoint, then you're going to be missing people. And I think when you get to polls and people say, why are you so dismissive of these other polls? I say, well, if you only have white English-speaking callers calling Latinos, It's the same as would we send these white English-speaking, canvassers to Latino communities? I think what you're hearing from the folks on the ground is, of course, they wouldn't do that. They're trying to send culturally, and we're trying to do the same thing in the research space. But I was going to add, to this point about Central Florida, that if you look at the gains where Clinton made over Obama in both Orange County and Osceola County, she got over 45,000 more votes than Obama. Okay, so she lost the state of Florida. She, in Orange County and Osceola County, also in Miami-Dade as well, is more than 100,000 there. But in those two, over 45,000 more votes. And so we know, and if you look at some of the precincts in Kissimmee, many of them over 10 points higher voter turnout. So we know that there was this more engagement. We know that there were more votes coming in. And so I think that, against the backdrop of a loss, you can find these stories that were proven to be very successful. We shouldn't give up on them. We should go and look at the micro data and say, this worked. This worked. Not oh, we lost Florida, so none of this worked. In those places where they were active, this worked. It worked very, very well.
Yeah, that was my
Can you-
fear.
oh, so go ahead.
That my fear was after the elections, everybody was, as we say in Spanish, de luto. And so nobody wanted to celebrate anything. And so we pushed to just put out a, applause to the Puerto Rican community in the I-4 corridor because they won in other ways that are significant for their political future.
Right.
So I think that as much as we can, and I respect your grieving process, we gotta still try to
Get over it, Angie.
milk the victory.
Well, and if I could just jump in to agree, I think your mention of the caravanas, I think it really raises a really important point in where we are in campaigns right now. Is that I know I myself have been oftentimes too rigid. I remember when I campaigned in Puerto Rico for Hillary a few years ago, I was like, what do you mean you don't have a van, right? But we have to take that approach with every community. And we have to trust the local community organizers and our organizers to try different things to see how do we still meet our common goal. And I know that that's something as a campaign organizer that I've really had to learn. And I would say that is just a tremendous thing that I think we need to double down on moving forward, not just in electoral politics, but issue organizing, of going where people are and integrating our campaign into their community, not the other way around. I think another thing that I think of when you were mentioning the caravanas is when Hillary did back of the kitchen tours at the casinos. And it was literally going where people were, right? If those women and those workers were not going to be at home when we knocked on their doors, she was going to go where they were. And I just think that that's such an important thing that we have to continue to push and advocate for.
One thing I'll add real quick, and that is that this is all right, correct, but there is a challenge for the canvassers out there that are going door knocking. I remember working with Chris Torres at Center for Community Change, who at one point said, finding the qualified, reliable canvassers to go out there as we were getting closer and closer to election day, it was a mad dash to find them because again, the culturally competent. And if you're talking to the Puerto Rican community, then having the Venezuelan or the Peruvian like myself going out there without the understanding of the community, maybe something's missed. Maybe they're not really as convincing. But finding those Puerto Ricans getting closer, was a challenge, especially looking at the numbers that they wanted to hit and that they did hit in both Colorado and Nevada as well as in Florida. It really is a challenge. So I think there's a lot of work for Florida to do in terms of getting out to vote, but also an opportunity for people to get involved and really become part of that process.
Well, and I think that that's a challenge that we'll minimize with every election cycle, with every issue campaign, because we're bringing more people into the process. For example, in Nevada, we ran a robust high school program, right? We couldn't find paid canvassers. I mean, the same issue, right? Either people who were culturally competent or were willing to go into those communities. And so I think it's so important for building the pipeline, for building the bench, and that's why all of these programs and really saying anyone who wants to contribute has a place in this organization. Because it starts with one little ounce of engagement.
And what I loved in this last election cycle was the participation of dreamers. And so talk a little bit about that and talk about, because I always like to say the undocumented people don't all live in one apartment building and only interact with each other, right? So we've got lots of folks in mixed status families. Does that inspire Latino voters to come out to vote, or are they nervous and anxious about it? So just talk a little bit about that.
I think it's not just Latino voters that inspires. I think back at my time in Nevada during the caucus, we had that Dreamer Roundtable. Everyone left the Dreamer Roundtable, much to my turmoil, undecided, still, right? They wanted to hear from all the candidates, which is so incredibly important for them and so smart. And so it really began a relationship building, right? Where they jumped on calls with our policy advisors. They had calls with Maya. You know, the Dreamers in Nevada were saying, well, we don't like this, or we need to advocate for this. And what about my parents? And what about my aunt who's been waiting 15 years? And so they really, I think, were not just incredibly active. They were not just incredibly impactful, but they were incredibly influential in everything from our policies to our organizing tactics. And that's so important. One story that I just want to bring up, and if people have not seen this video, Google Hillary Clinton Brave, is the story of Carlita, who, as a part of this relationship building with Dreamers, you know, one of the last things, you know, they said, well, Hillary promised us that she would meet with us and our families. And so about 3 or 4 days, maybe it was a Sunday, I think, before the caucus, it was on the Saturday, Hillary had a closed door meeting with Dreamers and their parents. In fact, the full press was there and she asked them to leave. Completely off the record. And there was a little girl, Carlita, who ended up speaking at the National Convention, who started crying, sharing her story. And I think that she was really symbolic for our campaign about what was truly on the line, even in the primary. And I think that for us, you know, at that point, we were in a very difficult place, even in the caucus in Nevada. And I really credit that one ad that we cut with Carlita and telling that story for really pushing us over. And I don't think it was just Latino voters, but I think it added an additional, you know, layer of, you know, sympathy or empathy, or, you know, for moms that might be watching that, or for sisters, or for families and parents.
I think there's there's a similarity. There's two things I want to say, but one similarity between the connection with the Dreamers and the Puerto Rican experience. And that is that our messaging that I think resonated well with the Puerto Rican community was that they were voting on election day for themselves and the interests of their families in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of education that's missed on that. That, you know, there's so many Puerto Ricans arrive in the United States with automatic, you know, not citizenship, but automatic ability to vote, and Puerto Ricans on the island don't. And so we had to be careful, of course, on the messaging. We didn't want to say, you know, your vote, it counts twice.
No, please
Because
don't
then
say
we
that.
would have, you know, fallen into that
Good
hole.
luck.
Yeah. But anyway, so that messaging falls in line with the Dreamers, right? Because it really is, you're voting for this young community that can't vote, can easily be deported, and are risking everything while you risk nothing, right? Now, you're not going to be as aggressive as that last part, but that's what it's about. We're risking everything, and I credit, my gray hairs may not be as evident, you know, visible that back there, but they're there. And so I remember 10 to 15 years ago, where this Dreamer movement really started happening, with the one person coming out publicly to say, I'm undocumented, Ike, right? That really started a movement that I do believe inspires voters, inspires people to come out, because we are very family oriented, and that could be my daughter, my nephew, my son, right? And so I think that messaging will continue to resonate, and the fear with every presidential cabinet nominee that comes out will continue to drive folks to feel like we've got to do something. And in a time when people would normally think, you know, we're going to cower in fear, it's actually the opposite, and you're still hearing them, and if anything, it's a galvanizing opportunity for them to come out and get ready for these midterms. So.
And I think one thing that's so important for us all to remember and to really absorb the responsibility here is that these Dreamers did risk everything. They risked everything to come out for our campaigns, for our events, to stand up to Donald Trump and his brutal, horrifying policies. And it's not over. And now we have to risk everything to have their back. So I think that's just something we cannot forget.
I think, you know, related to your opening point there, Angie, about where the communities are, there's so much integration here. So the larger takeaway here is we need to find the right culturally appropriate, culturally sensitive surrogates to canvass, to get our vote out, to talk to us, that we may not and should not just use the traditional approaches. But, you know, 60% of Latino voters told us this year that they personally know an undocumented immigrant. And half of those said it was someone in their family. So half of 60 is 30. So 30% of the actual voters say someone in their family is undocumented. For many of them, it's their parents. It was the largest response, was my parents are undocumented. And for those other 30% to get up to 60, it's someone in their personal network. And so this is something that touches people. In the I-4 corridor, it may not be that connection to undocumented immigrants, but it might be 60% who has family on the island. And so the idea is find those points that are important, that aren't just policy prescriptions, that are certainly important, but may not tug at people's heartstrings to remind them what's important. And so, the research that was done this year, the field work and the organizing that was done this year implemented these culturally appropriate ways, to find out who the best surrogates are and to connect with people in a Latino way, in a way that makes sense to us.
All right, that's a great segue to open up for questions from the audience. I could gobble up all the time talking to you guys, but I've got a few people sitting here that I think want to hear from you all as well. So are there any questions? Start here, and we'll go over.
Hello. Thank you very much to the entire panel and for having this really important discussion. My name is Abigail Golden Vasquez. I'm the director of the Latinos in Society program at the Aspen Institute. And I'd really like to hear a little bit more about the difference in the breakout in the way the Cuban vote came out compared to the Puerto Rican vote. Going into the election, I heard there's a new generation of Cubans that may think quite differently than the old guard. So I was wondering, how that played out. And another question for the whole panel actually is, how important really is the Dreamer movement for Latinos? And was there, quite a heavy bet placed on that as a, galvanizing issue versus things like the economy, which is the #1 issue, healthcare and jobs?
Great questions. Let's start with the Cuban question. Estrella, you want to take that one, and then we'll go to the next one.
Sure. I think it's really, it was really interesting when you looked at some of the numbers and the comparison to the Puerto Rican and the Cuban community, where you have generations of Cubans who have been, become citizens, politically active and able and ready to vote, and the Puerto Rican community that has come over. It's almost like a level set immediately because of their ability to participate politically and their activation, because it's the national sport in Puerto Rico. So those numbers, when you look at eligible Puerto Rican voters, I think it was 2014, please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, around 24% of the larger Latino population. And you compare that immediately to the Puerto Rican population, it was about the same. And so it's a surprisingly, it's unlike, had the Peruvians come to Florida, which we're numerous, and the food is plentiful and wonderful, and we're coming. So we'll do another panel on the Peruvian vote.
Exactly, and the Bolivian vote, I'm there.
But they would have had to take in a generation or two to catch up to the Cubans. Here you've got the Puerto Ricans immediately coming. They get it, it's a sport, so they're involved. And so that's really the interesting comparison, that dynamic when you look at the elections and the comparison of Miami-Dade and Broward to the I-4 corridor. And I think that's really what we're going to continue to see for another cycle or two, who's really coming out, who's turning out, and how within the Cuban community, generationally, they're looking at climate change issues, they're looking at more progressive agendas, and they start peeling off from their parents and the more Republican conservative base.
I'll say just quickly on Florida, that I think Estuardo has it exactly right, that in the I-4 area, we saw small vote share shifts to the Democratic side, but the Puerto Rican community in the I-4 in the Central Florida was already voting fairly heavily Democratic. What we saw was a lot more Puerto Rican voters. So you won a lot more votes there with about the same vote share, 75, 78, somewhere in that range. In Miami-Dade, we saw about a 10-point shift in Miami-Dade County among Latino voters to the Democratic side, and I have some slides.
Cuban specifically.
And in most pronounced and heavily Cuban, if you look in Hialeah Gardens and other places like that, most heavily pronounced in high-density Cuban precincts. And we saw that ahead of time. Dan Smith at the University of Florida, who was collecting and putting out all the early vote analysis, they recorded it by race and party, and he was showing record numbers of Cuban density precincts, Democratic votes, way higher than 12. So I think you're seeing some of that shift there. The Puerto Ricans didn't have much room to shift because they were already 75, 78, 80% Democratic. So there may have been a little bit of shift, but the bigger point is the one he was seeing there, and that's the story of Florida, is that there was a huge number of votes in Central Florida, way more than there was in 2012. And in South Florida, there was a bit of a shift, that the conservative politics are transitioning.
All right, how about on the second question? So is it immigration or is it the other issues like the economy or climate?
I would say I stand by our engagement with Dreamers. In fact, maybe I wish we would have done more. You know, I think that a mistake that we often make is not tying immigration and the economy together. They're completely intertwined.
Exactly right.
I also think among Dreamers is that, once again, if you look at the subgroups, right, there's a huge culture of advocacy that's so important. They tell a story and a narrative that almost none of us can. And for example, in Colorado, a really incredible, important voting bloc for us was millennials. And so Dreamers were, I think, a very persuasive messenger for millennials because they're sitting in the same classrooms together. They're in college together. They're working together. And I just think that the Dreamer movement is just getting started. I think things are really in a not great place right now. But we can't forget what they've accomplished with DACA and DAPA, and I think pushing so many of us, including myself, to try to be a little bit bolder.
And Matt, when you poll of the community, how do you hear the immigration issue relative to the other policy issues?
Yeah, it's a good question because Abigail's point that the economy always comes out first is correct. That people say that this is something that I care about, that I want policymakers to fix. I want them to improve wages. I want them to improve economic opportunities. It certainly is the top of everyone's list as we come through this recovery right now. What we find in the political sphere, though, is that immigration tends to be a better mobilizing issue. That is, that all of the candidates will stand up and say, yeah, I want to improve the economy too. Nobody stands up and campaigns against, well, few, I guess maybe some did this year, lower wages. There were certainly some. But generally, their economic plan is, we all want to improve the economy. Right? Every candidate wants to make the American economy better, but every candidate does not want to help immigrants. So it's an area where there's incredible division. It's very clear where the candidates stand. As we said, it's very personal. So yes, people want better working opportunities, better wages, better labor laws, better pro-labor policies. But when it comes to really getting them out and getting them to turn out, it's this connection to Dreamers and to other immigrants, to people on the island, that it tugs at their heartstrings more.
Well, I'll make that quick distinction that the Puerto Rican community doesn't suffer from the same immigration challenges, but
Right,
yet
obviously
in their
they're
polling,
citizens.
it is something that they care about because they see a direct connection to that immigrant experience, and that's an amazing and awesome thing because of how Florida breaks out. I mean, when they go there, they're surrounded by South Americans as well, and Central Americans and Mexicans.
Yeah.
So it's great to see that they are also moved by this issue, but it's not. It's the economy and education.
When I think when you're looking at Latinos, we look at turnout, and then for many of us, we also look at organization and capacity and just the expansion of our campaign. I think that Dreamers and immigration really, really, really helped us with that latter part of making sure that people were taking action, that they were not waiting. And to your point about 30% of people who know somebody who's been directly affected, those are 30% of people that are primed to get involved in a campaign because it's so important to them.
All right, another question, the gentleman in the white shirt there.
You. Rafael Bernal with the Hill Latino. So, Emmy, you mentioned you guys were campaigning for 2 years to get to everyone in Nevada and Colorado. That clearly wasn't the case everywhere. So I'm wondering if you guys know of any pockets of people who weren't reached and sort of what factors contributed to this. And if you could touch on sort of internal debate within the Democratic Party. There's a Sanders-Clinton thing, and then there's a debate over which consultants to use and so on. You know the story. And how much of it could have been attributable to voter suppression tactics?
Well, I mean, I think we should start with voter suppression tactics, right? I think that these are both states, in Colorado and Nevada. I'll give you this example. In Colorado, if you move, we know the Latino community, younger people tend to be more transient, more mobile. If the Secretary of State, which is full mail-in ballot in Colorado, by the way, if they send you a card saying, keep an eye out for your ballot and it bounces back, you're automatically marked as an inactive voter. which means that if you're expecting to get your ballot, you may never get it. And that means that you would have to know where to go, where to re-register, what to do to get that active. And so I think that's a whole other panel on
Right.
how we make sure that we expand voting rights and voting access. And the same, I think we can have that conversation about caucuses on Saturday mornings for families, or county conventions or state conventions, whatever the case might be. I would say, look, campaigns are a trade-off. You have to make decisions based on the capacity and the resources that you have. I'm really proud of my campaign nationally, and our effort to reach all Latinos everywhere. I mean, we talked to Latinos in Texas, we talked to them in Arizona, right? We had a 50-state strategy. But of course, there's always a trade-off. You unfortunately cannot always reach everyone. And I think one thing that we don't talk about often enough is the partners that do that work. Labor is a great example of that. I've mentioned the AFL-CIO, culinary, just there's an abundance, I think, of strength and capacity in our labor partners. But there's also local groups. For example, the Latino Initiative in Colorado, who had weekly, nightly phone banks across the state focused on just calling Latinos, not just Democrats, not just Republicans or unaffiliateds. Any Latino that was registered, they were going to call them and have a one-on-one conversation with them about why it was so important. And I do believe that that made a difference and helped us, I think, pull off a tiny victory in places that we might not have otherwise. But I think it's important for us to be reflective. Certainly, there's always things to improve. Had we won, I would be saying the exact same thing. But I think it's also important for us to acknowledge our strengths and to continue to build upon them.
All right, one more question. The lady in the back with the...
Hi, I'm just wondering if there are any statistics that have been done on the number of eligible Hispanic voters there were and how many of those eligible Hispanic voters actually voted.
So nationally, we think there's about 27 million eligible adult citizens. Those numbers will come out. The final turnout numbers won't come out until two pieces of information come out. One is the actual vote history file that's put on the voter file, in which they know each individual whether or not you did or did not vote. Once that information is available, there'll be some attempt to discern how many were Hispanic and voted. And then the second that comes out every year is the census. CPS, they do a survey in November, just as they do with their other surveys, and they ask people, were you registered, did you vote? So a lot of those national numbers that we have on how many Latinos are eligible and voted in each cycle comes from the census, and so that's March or April or so by the time they clean the data and get it out. So unfortunately, we don't have a firm number on that statistic, but we know in the places, as I referenced, in precincts in Kissimmee and in other places, where you look at heavily Latino areas, enclaves, neighborhoods, you can compare directly to 2012, and we see generally more voters, higher voter turnout in those areas, which suggests that there were more Latinos voting and voting at higher rates, but we don't have a raw number yet.
All right, great. I'm going to just throw out one last question. I want to fast forward 4 years, which is a personal thing, right? I really want to have happen right now. But so 4 years, we're not yet at Election Day. But tell me, what kind of investments, what do you want to see replicated from what happened in 2016 to 2020, and what do you want to make sure doesn't happen regarding Latino voter?
I would say community investment. So that includes, investing in staff, but also accommodating and creating programs based on the community that you're in. I think looking at Latinos and subgroups is incredibly important. We're not one shape fits all. We don't all care about the same issues. We all have very different backgrounds. Not replicated. Well, I hope that we don't have a candidate on either side that completely beats up the Latino community.
I'm just going to add on, I think the 2-year model is the right one. It should be replicated. Obviously, that's the resources and staffing question. We can be idyllic and say everyone should do, or every major Latino state should do the 2-year model or use a 2-year model. With that is tied also what I don't want to see happen again, even though I've seen it happen many presidential cycles in a row, is the lack of investment in the Latino and Latina political talent. There are really talented people, cycle after cycle after cycle, who are brought on to campaigns and to the party late in the game, given these huge goals, and many of them meet those goals, but they're understaffed, under-resourced, and it sets up a very huge challenge for them. So, we've got 4 years,
Right,
right?
to identify them and invest in them.
Well, I would say you got 2 years if we do the 2-year model, really to get invested in recruiting these people, keeping them active, and finding the resources to have them succeed.
I'm going to follow up on that point and give a plug to one of our best partners who's here in the audience, Cristobal Alex and the Latino Victory Project. He's probably wanting to jump up out of his seat right now because they're heading up this program right now, which potentially would have been for a transition, I think, and trying to place as many talented Latinos into government offices, which we still need, but collecting resumes and collecting people to help identify Latinos to get integrated. And that's absolutely, if you look at the examples that Emmy gave from Nevada and Colorado, how they had these just incredibly diverse state infrastructures there for those campaigns in those 2 states. Not just a Latino team, but they had Latinos everywhere. And what the Latino Victory Project is doing is trying to collect as many resumes and working with others, NHLA and others in this space to try and get those folks placed into these campaigns in Florida in 2018 when there's a gubernatorial race in these other places. So we absolutely need that. We need to be integrated into all aspects, and not just political campaigns, but issue campaigns, advocacy groups as well. So the more young Latinos we get integrated, I think, the more of a voice we can have, the more we can tell our story and be involved. And then, of course, not surprisingly, perhaps where I started this conversation,
I thought you might say.
what do I not want to see happen again? I am pleading with the people who run the exit poll to take the Latino vote seriously, to look at their own memos from years before, and to do a better job of collecting accurate, culturally competent data in the Latino community that truly reflects who we are.
Mil gracias. Round of applause, folks. Terrific panel. Thank you so much.
Great job.
Great.